What's up? It's BD. Today, I finally get to do something I wanted to do for a while now, and I finally got the courage to film in the gym. So, today I am talking about exercises for better sexual performance. That would be mainly for the hamstrings, glutes, hip adductors, and hip flexors. Now, these muscles just increase or decrease the angle of the hip. So, in the sack, just use your imagination why we want to work on these muscles. Now, the quads are important, but all they do is bring your knee forward. It's useful in pushing movements, but it's not useful for, let's say, lateral movements. And on top of this, working your hamstring, glutes, etc. is much better for athletic performance than just, say, working your quads, which most of you probably already knew. But doing these exercises will make you better in the sack, as well as a better athlete if you're still in that phase of your life. I'm also going to show you how I unlock my hips before I do my leg workouts. So it's very useful for injury prevention and workout performance. So making those heavy lifts feel good in general, and you'll be able to move more weight after you've developed the flexibility needed to properly do these lifts. So if you have a bad squat, these exercises, or these stretches rather, will help you improve in that regard. Now, this also helps a ton for sexual health, and that's why I'm covering it in this video. But there's also more stretches specifically for the pelvic floor, which I will cover in another video, which will help immensely as well. So let's start. So the first thing I like to do with every workout now is relatively mild cardio to warm up, about 10 minutes on an incline treadmill, just to break a sweat and get my heart rate into the fat burn zone. If you know anything about heart rate variability and exertion levels, this is just a good way to make sure that you're exerting effort long term and sustainably. So now let's move on to stretching. A lot of you probably learned how to stretch as kids, like in sports and stuff like Little League baseball. The thing is, you probably didn't learn the proper way to stretch because there's a little more nuance to it than what your T-ball coach is going to tell you. So I'm just going to walk through it, ways you can improve the stretch and actually hit the muscles that we're supposed to. So start off with stretching the quads. It's real simple. The main thing you want to worry about is keeping your knee in line with your other knee. So that means you're not pulling it far behind you. Also, don't try to make it a balance thing and support yourself, because if you're focusing on two things at once, you're limiting the stretch. And then to change the way you work the heads of the quad on the stretch, you just pull your leg across you to the other side of your hip. So now for the standing hamstring stretch, not toe touches. So I round my back and grab my calves and then pull my torso into my knees. I stop when it gets uncomfortable. You want your knees to be in a neutral position, which means not locked like you were taught in small sports, little kid sports. We are not touching our toes because this limits the stretch you can apply to your hamstrings. And then the single leg hamstring stretch is the same idea, except you grab behind your ankle and then pull your torso down to the side. The way you position your feet will change which head of the hamstring is stretched. Well, at least compared to others. So if you turn your foot out, it's going to work the internal heads of the hamstring more, so closer to the medial line of your body. And then if you keep your feet straight out, it's going to be a little more balanced. And if you turn them in slightly, it's going to be the outward heads of the hamstring. Now, on the floor, we're going to do butterflies. So we're going to bring our feet together and knees out. I'm pretty sure most of you already know how to do this. But you want to pull your feet back to you, not up like they do in T-ball. You can also apply more tension on the downward motion of the movement by pushing your knees into your elbows. But I kind of think that's superfluous. So seated toe touch next. I do these more for the lower hamstrings. As my lower back opens up, I will go deeper into this position. The way I get my lower back more is by not trying to grab as far as I can, but more or less trying to keep my upper back straight as I pull down. And then I bring my other leg in to release the tension from my other hamstring. Now the straddle stretch, I can't go very deep in this, but that's not the point. The point is to get these muscles to elongate, right? So I pull forward, I round my back since we're trying to stretch out these lumbar muscles. And all you do is lean forward as far as you can. My sister, who's a gymnast, can like literally just lay flat on the floor. Me, stiff back, not so much. And then finally you can do it with your legs together. As you can tell by my face, it was pretty intense today. It's the same as pulling your torso to your hips when you're standing, except since your butt's on the ground, your butt can't go back to relieve some of the tension, so you feel it all in the hamstrings. All right, so typical glute stretches are next. Grab your knee and pull it directly up to your rib cage. If you pull it to the side a bit, it's going to work the hip abductors a bit more. I personally want to get as much tension as I can on my glutes to release them for my deeper squats and such. As you can tell, I am very excited to be doing legs today. All right, this is the hip abductor stretch. While you can crack your back doing this, that's wrong. While lying flat, you want to bring your knees over your bodies and twist while keeping your shoulders flat on the ground. And then gravity is going to do most of the stretching for you. You're going to feel this all on the side of your hip and a bit in your butt. And if you can tell, I am applying a little bit more pressure with my offhand, and that's just because your glutes itself are very strong muscles for their size, so they sometimes need a little more tension if you've been working on them for a while. You can also do it straight leg as well, but I don't really see the added benefit unless you're trying to stretch out the hamstring at the same time. Next up is the piriformis stretch, like the glute stretch, but you want to have your other leg on top of the other, or the leg that you were pulling. The leg above the leg that you're pulling will feel the stretch. And the smaller gap you make between your legs, the more intense the stretch will be. You also want to keep your back flat against the ground, but your hips will roll up. However, if you are starting to curl at the top, you're going to lose tension on that muscle and you're not really going to feel it. All right, now for the funky stuff. Frog pose. This is probably my favorite thing to get the hip flexors. So you're going to place your knees wide out, and then you're going to have your feet come together into a point behind you. You're going to put your elbows on the ground, and then you're going to lean back. This is going to put a bunch of tension on your hip flexors. And then if you're very tight, you're going to have to pulse stretch to release them so you can get deeper into the position. This will be huge for you guys that do heavy squats and have relatively poor mobility. And then this lunge stretch, it's a hit or miss depending on the person. In this lunging position, press your elbows into your thigh and then twist your torso out to your opposite leg. And then I lean forward slightly in the stretch to enunciate it. And then notice how my legs are a little wider than the typical stretch. It's hard to tell in this angle, but I go out more instead of forward. And then because I missed these at the beginning, this is the cobra stretch for abs. So what you do is you lay flat and then you lift your body up with your elbows and then pull back your back into hyperextension, or is it hyperflexion? Either way, you are pulling up, stretching out the abs as much as you can. And then if you go up a bit on your toes, it makes the stretch even more intense. I've been saying intense a lot probably, huh? Also, mind the bedhead. I literally just rolled out of the bed this morning, went to the gym to film this before anyone else got there. And then the pigeon stretch. Again, this is a hit or miss. You want to bring your knees to your torso like they were in the glute stretch, but then instead of you applying the pressure with your hands, you are using upwards force to push your hips into your thigh almost. And this is going to work your glutes and a bit of the hip flexors. And you don't really need to worry about it for the majority of the exercises in this video. But if you're a heavy squatter or heavy deadlifter, having good ankle mobility is key for good form, especially at heavier weights. So stretch out your calves. Standard block stretches help a ton. And then you're going to need to stretch out the exact opposite muscle, which is the tibialis. So instead of pointing your feet upwards like that, it's hard to show, so like that, you want to pull them back like this. Yes, that makes sense with a wrist. But anyway, and yeah, I have to take my shoes off for this just so I can get the proper roll of the toe to get the tibialis. And then we need to get our plantar fascia, just because I don't know about you, but I hate having tight toes when I'm trying to lift. So I will push my toes up and stretch out that tendon at the bottom. Might be a ligament, not 100% sure, but that covers my stretching. That usually takes anywhere from 5 to 10 minutes, depending on how sluggish I am that day. So now that we're all loosey-goosey, we can finally train. So we're gonna start with leg curls. So lying leg curls is to pre-exhaust our hamstrings, making the mind-muscle connection more paramount as we move on in our workout. Now there are two variants I like to do. Now that is spine neutral and then spine extended. So that means you're rolling your spine down a bit. And in this video or demonstration, the machine's default is for spine extended because this puts more pressure on the entire length of the hamstring. Now, for our intended purposes, which is sexual performance, we actually want our spine to be neutral to increase glute engagement just a tad. And it's not necessarily that you're going to be working the glutes, but you're going to be working the hamstring a little bit higher up on the muscle belly. So yes, so the changes in spine and hip flexion will change which part of the muscle group is worked. And this will vary depending on your own muscle's positioning. Since we want to work on the top of the hamstring and the glutes, the spine neutral would be preferred, but if you're training to failure, spine extended is usually good enough. For many of these exercises, you want to hold the flex for a second at the top to help really focus at the end range of motion, because again, think about what we're trying to do here and where the end performance increase needs to be. For demonstration purposes, I showed both spine neutral and spine extended. I know a lot of gyms don't have a lying leg curl, but seated will work as just as well. You just won't be able to target the higher end of the muscle belly as much, but if you're trained to failure, it probably doesn't really matter in the long run. It's just for optimal results, you want to tweak your form just a tad to. Now on to stiff leg deadlift. Now this can be rough on the lower lumbar, so if you have back issues, be warned. Resistance bands can be used in place of the barbell, but you want to enunciate the top of the movement more instead of the bottom, like I will show in a second. And so you may notice I'm standing on a plate. Depending on your limb length and flexibility, you might need a platform for full range of motion. The key here is you're bending at the hip and not at the knee. I know that sounds counterintuitive to everything you're taught about lifting heavy things, but we are trying to isolate the hamstring and glutes. And they only do two things, or really one thing, and that is straightening out the leg. That's what they do. So the cue here is hips back, pushing your butt out into space. You want to have your spine neutral for optimal hamstring activation. So flexion is fine for this, like bringing your spine tight, but that's going to work or engage the lats more. And again, it's just not optimal if you're just trying to isolate the hamstrings. It's fine if you're lifting heavy. Believe me, you want to get that lat activation. But for low weight, high endurance, or high volume exercises, you might want to consider keeping your spine neutral. I like to hold the bottom of this exercise. That stretch response is a very powerful hypertrophy stimulus. It's not needed, but again, it is optimal for size and performance increase. Another important thing to mention, and it might be a theme throughout most of this, is the position of your feet will change where you feel the movement. This will be dependent on your own morphology, so like where your hamstrings insert and how long these tendons are connecting your hamstrings and such. But personally, I like to have my toes point straight out during this and then try to have my feet as close together as possible. But since I have dummy thick thighs, it's hard to get my feet closer as they grow. So, and then some days, literally just depending on the day, I like to have my toes pointed out a bit so I can get the internal heads of the hamstring more. Play around with it, see what feels best for you. And all these exercises I'm showing, and for our purposes, should be done with volume. So here I recommend anywhere from 15 to 20 reps at moderate weight. Really feel the burn, and you want to be a little winded afterwards, if we're being completely honest. Barbell glute bridges. This can be loaded a lot, but again, for our purposes, we are trying to work on endurance. You do not need a bench for this. It just increases the range of motion. Again, fellas with back issues, just do this with your back on the floor to limit the strain you're putting on your spine. You'll see a lot of people with padding on the bar. That's fine. I personally don't, because I have the thigh mass to spread out the weight, and the lower weights here, it's more tolerable than, say, if you're doing this for 185. I prefer to start with the weight on me and then drop into position, but it doesn't really matter if you use full-size plates. It's going to be easier for it to be on the floor, and then you step up into position or scoot up, whatever. On the first rep, I bring my feet in. This takes the hamstrings almost completely out of the movement, making this solely a glute and hip abductor worker. And I noticed this after I was done filming, that this bench is actually a little bit too high for me. So you want to have your knees in line with the top of whatever bench you use, and you can probably use like a plate like I did in the other video to raise your feet up to the correct position. Your body weight is part of the load in this exercise. So the higher up you are on the bench, the less body weight is in the load. So in the first couple sets or reps, I should have been about 3 inches forward, meaning my shoulders should have been the one supporting my body weight than rather the middle of my back. That way I get a little more body weight into the exercise, increasing the actual load. And I I do a isometric hold at the top of this movement for about 2 to 3 seconds. This is one because I wasn't getting the correct height on my knee, so I needed to hold that position longer to get active muscle or the correct amount of muscle activation. So since we're trying to work at the end of the range of motion a bit more, these isometric holds are going to help us achieve that goal. And then removing the weights, removing the bar from you is always going to be awkward just because you're pinned to the ground. So just be ready. It's much easier with standard plates, but if you're trying to film and you can't see the hip movement that I'm trying to show, you got to use the tiny bars. Anyway, we are now moving on to the final exercise of this video, and that is cable good mornings. Now this one is probably the weirdest looking one in the set. It's quite literally the opposite of stiff leg deadlifts. Tension is applied at the top of the movement instead of at the bottom. Your limb length will determine how far you stand away from the machine. I prefer having my feet a little bit wider than shoulder width and then toes pointed out. And then the movement starts with you bent over 90 degrees at the hip. So again, neutral spine, and I brace my elbows against my hips to keep the rope in a neutral position. And this, you'll primarily feel this in your glutes. There are a ton of different leg exercises you can do, and a lot of them overlap when it comes to functionality, muscle groups worked, etc. You don't have to do all 4 of these exercises every leg day. Just incorporate them into your current routine. Yes, they look funny, but remember what we're trying to achieve here. Optimal hip flexion, and these exercises are great auxiliary movements for both squat and deadlift because it trains your posterior chain so well without putting excessive load compressing the spine. So that should cover it. Next up is abs, and let's just say I have fat boy abs. So, and then I'm also going to cover cardio protocols for optimal performance in the bedroom. So I hope you learned something. If you like what I do, subscribe. If you like this video in particular, like it. I have a Patreon. This is BD signing off.